All right, we're going to get started. Again, thank you all for joining us. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about this webinar series. My name is Rod Falcon. I'm a research director at the Institute for the Future. This is a webinar series we call Foresight Talks. I'm going to share a little bit more about that first before I introduce our guests. And we'll jump right in. So Foresight Talks, IFTF Foresight Talks is all about growing foresight capabilities across our community through enhanced connections, mutual learning, and better awareness of community needs. Our agenda today will be this quick introduction. Then we're going to be in conversation with Geshe Karuri Sabina, and then we'll take some Q&A, some questions from the audience. You're going to be able to type those questions in a moment and throughout the session. But let me tell you a little bit more about IFTF Foresight Essentials. This is a portfolio of trainings that are designed to empower you and your organization to implement strategic foresight and navigate large-scale change and move and lead toward a more vibrant future. For individuals, we have our flagship training program and an amazing Design Futures training class, as well as Futures training on Coursera. We also just created a new course on scenario building. The next scenario class is full, but we have a new one where we're going to be opening enrollment, and I'll be sharing more about that. For teams, we also customize our foresight training for you and your teams, and we also have leadership courses taught by our distinguished fellow, Dr. Bob Johansson, and these are all customized for your group or organization's needs. And finally, for the larger community, we have many free resources, including this webinar series, the Ask a Futurist webinar, where you get to meet IFTF staff and ask them your questions, our certified practitioner meetups, exclusive to IFTF alumni, and our monthly Foresight Essentials newsletters, where you can, where we share tips, research, and events related to futures thinking. So please look for all of that and be part of our community. Again, one of our newest classes is IFTF Design Futures. Many of you out there are combining futures research and thinking with design. And so we have a few of our leading design futurists on staff that are now teaching this course. So if you'd like to learn more information, just email me or Aicha, my colleague, who's also listening here today, and we'll get you enrolled. So just a few things about Zoom webinar. So again, introduce yourself and make comments in the chat section. Make sure you've selected all panelists and attendees to do that. You're going to be able to ask questions in the Q&A portion of the webinar, but you won't be doing this in chat. Please ask questions in the Q&A section. Everyone is automatically muted and your videos are turned off. Okay, I am super excited to have our guest speaker today. Her name is Geshe Karuri Sabina. And let me tell you a little bit about her, and then we're going to jump in and have a conversation. I had the pleasure of meeting virtually Geshe sometime last year when we were doing research on foresight practitioners and really trying to learn and build a playbook for strategic foresight. And Geshe and I had a wonderful conversation, and I hope to recreate some of that today. But she is a scholar practitioner based in Johannesburg, working at the intersection between people, place, and social technical change. Her work is mainly in Africa and the Global South, and she has a diverse background spanning a range of foresight, policy, innovation, and practice topics, and has worked extensively in R&D, government, and civic organizations. She holds several current affiliations, including the national organizer for the Civic Innovation Network hosted at Wits University. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Cape Town's African Center for Cities and founding director of the Southern Africa node of the Millennial Project. She's also a faculty member at Singularity University on the future of cities and a curator of the Emergence Network, and recently the Africa curator for the UNESCO Futures Literacy Summit in 2020. She holds degrees in computer science and sociology, master's degree in urban planning and architecture from UCLA, and a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. There's a lot more that we could say, and I'm going to ask Aicha to share her Geshe's full biography with you. But for now, I want to jump right in and start our conversation. So just give me a moment and I'll stop sharing. Hi, Geshe.
Hi, Rod. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to have you. So we have a good number of people listening. And like I said, this is a webinar for our Foresight practitioner community. And we all have, really our own unique journey when we come and sort of begin to integrate foresight into our work. And so let's start off by you sharing, what was your journey coming into foresight, and how did foresight become part of the work that you do?
Thanks, Rod. And first of all, let me apologize for the darkness I'm in. I see there are some people in South Africa here, so they'll understand exactly what's happening. We call it load shedding. And I'm right in the middle of it, but glad to be able to connect. And thanks for this question. It's a long story, and as you said, everybody has theirs. I like to call mine a series of awakenings or epiphanies along the way, and it really dates back for me to around 2001, where South Africa was involved with several other African countries. So our then President Thabo Mbeki, with other presidents, Obasanjo from Nigeria, Bouteflika from Algeria, and Wade from Senegal, had conceptualized the NEPAD programs, the New Partnership for Africa's Development. And it was meant to be this big African Renaissance linked regeneration program for the continent. And I was asked, as part of a team from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, to lead a research support team for the infrastructure theme. Now, these are big infrastructures. It was the ICT infrastructure, the transport, the energy, the water. And I was coming from a background that seemed logical, tech, architecture, planning, and I was doing long range work. Right. But nothing that prepared me for the scope of what this was about. The scale, the diversity, the complexity, the time horizons, and basically what that landed us into was a really intense training program in, first of all, some problem solving and systems thinking tools, but then foresight. So that was the big introduction to foresight. And at that time, it was scenario planning. We were reading Peter Schwartz. We were doing training like many people here possibly have done as well. And we developed regional scenarios for Southern Africa at the time, Southern Africa 2015, actually, which is obviously long past now. And we did lots of other work, that work's now been taken up, I think, in the AU. It's contributed to what's now Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, and their chair's Letter to the Future. And basically, that was a major epiphany about the language of the future, and that we could produce these cool, clever scenarios, and they somehow gave us some hooks with which to think about 20, 30, 50-year infrastructures in quite complex environments. Around the same time, Jerry Glenn from the Millennium Project was actually based in South Africa, coincidentally. And in meeting him and a few of us getting together, we then set up in 2004 I should say the second African node of the Millennium Project, because there was an Egyptian one already. And that was really about beginning to build community. That was about beginning to have, we had this mission of expanding the culture of futures thinking. And we got involved in all sorts of things. We conducted research on the role actually of scenario planning in South Africa's history. We put out a book called Breaking the Mold. We can share a link on that. And so these deep stories and these deep narratives about that history. And so there was lots of great stuff that happened then. We built up a platform called Foresight for Development. And that was about a space where Africans could share their foresight work, because that wasn't well known. We did a lot of work on local foresight, international foresight. But I think the real shift for me and the conversation we had, Rod, was really around 2013, 2014, where we got involved in a series of conversations linked to UNESCO around these ideas of reimagining Africa's future and decolonizing Africa's future. And I think there, between the work of Riel Miller and meeting Bayo Akomolafe, who are both really good friends now, and really beginning to play with ideas of emergence and futures literacy, I think I had my second great epiphany, which was really a recognition that there were some niggling concerns I was having. And in fact, there were people thinking into this space, and there were different ways and different approaches, different questions about futuring that I could ask. Mm-hmm. And that's been my story over the past 5 years, basically, is a journey into that space. Yeah.
So in this sort of second epiphany or awakening, as you said earlier, you had questions. Questions were coming up.
Yeah.
And I remember, so let's talk about those. And I also remember in our previous conversation, you were coming at this from strategic planning, which was also very distinct. And you had that training, but you were coming in with a distinct point of view. But I'm curious about how not necessarily how you resolved that, but what was coming up for you at that point when we were having this second awakening?
So I think I was getting concerned, when you come in and, you're a young African, probably a young anybody, you've got this real evangelical mission, right? You've got these tools you've learned and you're in fix-it mode. You think you can resolve things, you're gonna, fight poverty or fight climate change or do these things. And you believe you've got these tools that should enable you to do it. In my case, I was lucky that I had access to the scale of institutions that also ought to have allowed me to have these big impacts.
Right.
But I started getting very suspicious, first of all, that I was somehow maybe complicit in reproducing some of the futures I was trying to undo. I also began seeing a lot of the same stuff over and over. And so whether it was corporate foresight or government foresight or not-for-profit foresight, I would see in a way the scenarios were variations on the same theme over and over. And I began to wonder what that meant. I was suspicious about the intolerance for questioning, and I'd question all sorts of things. If I questioned why property law worked the way it did, or why, and there's a real intolerance for going there. So there were suddenly questions that couldn't be asked, that shouldn't be asked. So these things really begin to worry me. And I think from UNESCO's Futures Literacy Program, being allowed to ask questions like, where do our ideas for the future come from, was very empowering for me, actually, and allowed me, I think, to just go somewhere different.
Yeah. It's so curious because earlier you said you also did this, you're making me think, where do the ideas of the future come from? There's a whole history of the future, of what, are futures, and there's official futures, and you said you also did sort of a historical analysis of the futures of, I think you said South Africa. Yeah. You must have uncovered a lot of insights into just what you said, the language of the future, and how some of these things repeat themselves, and even just what are the sources of these ideals of the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in experimenting with this stuff, one of the things I did is, so I occasionally teach at the university.
Mhm.
And one of the memories I have is of working with a cohort of students. So these were human settlements planning students. And I thought I'd take them through a little futures literacy lab, just sort of playing with these ideas about the future. And after we'd gone through these phases, I asked them, these ideas you had about what you thought were preferable or probable futures, where do you think they came from now that you're looking at them? Because that's what the exercise led to. And it was really funny to see for them just a light bulb moment where they then said they're coming from the minister. Uh, everything we've said we think is likely in the future or that's desirable about the future is literally from the mouth of the minister, and their realization that when they were
Wow.
asked the same
Mhm.
question as human beings, not as staff members, they had a whole bunch of different questions and possibilities, but those didn't factor into the official question. And
Mhm.
that's one of the things actually we write about in one of the new projects we're in, is just this idea that as soon as you have an intellectual and institutional colonization of the future, where it's an elite activity by a few people, and then you instrumentalize that and you make it a political issue and a social sort of condition, but I think you end up exactly with that. I was speaking to a different group just last week, a young group actually working on digital futures in Africa, and it was really interesting because what they said when they looked at where their ideas of the future were coming from, they said all of them came out of their deepest fears or their realities, their contexts, and some said the movies they were watching. And so in all cases, what we concluded was that building ideas about the future from our worst nightmares, because that's what they were expressing, it's probably
Mhm.
not a great starting point. It's probably not very empowering, probably not
Right,
very
right.
creative.
I remember when I first started, there were all of these scenarios about the future of California and how diverse it was going to be. And a lot of it was written from really fear-based, but not everyone's afraid of the same things. That wasn't necessarily, a future that I feared.
Right, right. No, that's very true. And I think that's one of the things about the journey I'm on, that it's a little bit tricky because I suspect for many of us, and why we go into some of these fields, like I said, it's on a it's meant, we think I guess it's meant to be hopeful, and I think many organizations think the reason they use foresight is to have greater certainty or comfort about the
Mhm.
future. And I think for many of us who've been in the space for a while, you begin to realize actually that's not the point. This is not meant to make you feel more confident and more certain about anything. It's meant to expose you actually to how uncertain we are, and that maybe we need to develop approaches and capabilities that are cognizant of that. So I think that's been tricky sometimes because the future isn't necessarily a happy space for everybody. We know that now. I mean, we're in a pandemic, where
Great.
clearly it isn't. But that doesn't make it a future that one shouldn't think about.
I think it's so important what you're saying. It's also the outcome isn't necessarily just certainty, but even just engaging with change itself. Things are not immutable, things can change, and that can be very empowering and hopeful.
Yes, yes. Of course, things may change in ways that don't include you. Oh, there's the power. That may not include you in the way you wish. And I think that's
That's
another
great.
issue, So often, especially when we come into conversations about power and
Mm.
winners and losers, I think that's a very scary place for some people. And it's very difficult for some people to think about and in a way orient themselves to a future that, where they may not be the dominant, and that's a tricky space. So I think as long as we understand that in the space of foresight, we're not in the good news selling business, we're probably okay, because then we're open to a range of possibility. But I know for myself, for sure, I did very much start off on, I loved the epiphany people had when they got exposed to doing the foresight, as people often do. And unfortunately, I guess with that, you can really get into essentially the feel good moment that you want to see come with that, and the client is happy, and there's a happy scenario always. That fourth scenario, it's always a happy scenario. and you can win. Yes, we can. It's a tricky space. It's a tricky space, and I think I've had to do a lot of unlearning about some of those inclinations that were really coming from my own training and my own activism.
Right. One of the things that you helped me realize is that as foresight practitioners, so that we're not complicit in recreating the futures where people are disempowered or we're not represented, that we actually do have the capacity to decolonize, and that's kind of your current project as foresight practitioners. So I really want to come back to that, as you had this second epiphany that you didn't want to be complicit in recreating some of these scenarios you were trying to avoid. Share with us just, either some practices or what are the questions we need to bring to our work so that we avoid that?
Yeah. So I've been very involved in with a group, and I see some people in the audience here, developing a project called the Capacity to Decolonize. And it's really got to do, there's a whole literature, of course, and theory around decolonization. And in South Africa, it's got a very raw and present, reality to it as well. I think what we were exploring in this project is around, in a way, decolonizing the future. So how do we remove these strictures, these limitations we impose on the future, and what are the things one could do, and building futures literacy, we feel is part of that. I think for me, in my practice and my work, which is mainly around cities, as you mentioned in the intro, I've kind of reduced it to asking three kinds of questions. And they frustrate people because often when people call you to speak about the future of cities, they're looking for you to tell them the future of cities, right? And so often I probably try and dispatch with that in a few very quick minutes of saying, well, here are some of the pictures you're expecting to see. And now let's really talk about what matters about the future of cities. And for me, I brought it down to three things. I think one is that we've really got to get to this idea, the point about imagination. And many people are talking, and I'm so happy that many people are speaking about imagination now, because to me, that's one of the biggest things we could do to decolonize the future, is to remove those limitations, to allow ourselves and to allow other people to actually think new things. I spoke earlier about, being stopped from the questioning, being told you can't think that or you can't do that. I think it's so important that we understand we need new imaginations, and we need to allow people to have those imaginaries. The second one for me is around how do we involve people in new ways. I think, I made the point earlier just about the elitism sometimes and the professional hold that many of us have around, well, sometimes the methods of futuring and therefore the future, right? I mean, so the idea that a few people have a right or an ability to future, and therefore to determine those things. And I think there's so much, whether it's technology or attitudes we can hold, or consciousness that we can hold, that allows us to work with people differently. And I think we've absolutely got to do that. I really dislike this idea of, a few of us really clever, really well-meaning people are going to solve the problems of the world for the 6 billion. So the question I often ask is, what will the 6 billion be doing while you're doing that?
Right.
So just understanding that we can be so much more radically open and inclusive, and inclusion is not a destination. And the last bit is really the decolonized piece, which is the institutional piece, this idea that there's systems and tools that then disallow people to do anything differently. And whether those are laws or policies or methodologies or anything like that, how do you actually create institutions, spaces that really are open to changing themselves? I work quite a lot in the technology space, like you said, and one of the issues that really frustrates me there is that among all of the fears that we probably rightly have around technology, is that we often talk about technology only as that what we need it for is to do better or faster the things we were doing anyway. And that really frustrates me, because the real opportunity actually is to disrupt and to do things better. So I don't see what the point is in spaces like, I talk a lot about prop tech, just property technology. I don't see what the point is of doing better things that have actually, created horribly skewed property markets that don't work, that have created all sorts of problems. And here we are trying to make them more efficient. Why don't we imagine and also allow the for the possibility that we could actually do things quite differently, and it's okay to experiment with that. And the tech actually, is enabler of that, not just of efficiencies.
Mhm. That's such a great example to think about. Those property structures are probably reinforcing a lot of inequities, and we're deploying our futures practice to make them more efficient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's terrible. And then I get a bit frustrated as well then, because then the debates I often find that we end up in around tech are I would actually maybe say speculative, in the sense that they are often debates about fears we have about technology, about things that haven't happened yet. Whereas there's so many problems we do have that should worry us a lot more. And so again, just that kind of slight reframe that are we really concerned about all of the things that ought to concern us? And are we perhaps, I sometimes get this feeling that the present and the future gets molded for us, and we just kind of, orient to it. And that's, for me, is very troubling. That's not very empowering. It doesn't feel like freedom.
We're going to open it up to questions in a minute or so, but I wanted to ask you, here comes the future question. Where do you see this, where do you see your practice? Where are you going to take it? Where are you taking it next? I could be asking you about your fears and what's most exciting, and I'm certainly interested in that, but I'm also interested in your next journey, as a foresight, as a practitioner, really thinking hard and critical about this practice. Where are you taking it next?
So I thought you would ask me about my fear, but now you've made it even trickier. I think, I actually didn't think about this earlier, and I'd love to come off as some sort of sagely person who's figured it out, but I really haven't, and I face a lot of contradictions just because I still occupy a fairly institutional world. I do a lot of work with the public sector and with, in sort of the not-for-profit world, and in those spaces, I think where this thinking has led me to is beginning to tweak practices. It's very difficult. You've got, at the end of the day, if you're working for a client, and I think many people here might be doing that, or working for an organization, there's still some expectation that you deliver something, right? So whether it's the strategy you're being paid to deliver, or whether it's the course you're being asked to do, or where, so I still occupy that space. And sometimes I face a lot of internal contradiction around whether I actually believe this is useful. And I'm sure many of us do as well. You're kind of doing it, but you're not sure it's really going to get, at any place useful. So I find myself wrangling with that. And I'm learning to just occupy that space differently, with less conviction, less idealism, some sense of lostness, sometimes asking lots of questions, but also just experimenting. And sometimes the experiment is big, meaning I might suggest a completely different direction from what the organization thinks. But sometimes it's just saying, well, yes, I know you're asking me to do that, but what about? And I start trying to insert or infuse perhaps a different set of questions. And I must say that's going splendidly so far. There's a lot of trust that goes with it. So I'm still probably working with a lot of institutions that I have some history with. And so hopefully they don't think I'm trying to destroy everything. And so there's a little bit of leeway that comes with that. But so far, I think I'm really enjoying, I think where I'm going with this is experimentation and learning, and just really trying to see whether there's a way to be in these spaces and have the permission to occupy my body and my mind where it is right now. And so, so it's not easy, but that's what I'm doing.
That's great. Let's thank you, Aicha. Aicha is curating some of the questions that we're getting, and let's talk about China. We have a question about how China is investing heavily in Africa, and they're curious about, is China perceived as a colonizer or a partner? And what is that relationship going forward? What inspires you or concerns you about it?
So China is investing heavily, and I'm not an expert. I know a few experts on China-Africa relations. If the person's interested, I'm happy to connect them. I'm not aware that China has colonized literally anybody yet. A lot of other parties have colonized the continent quite literally. I think there are many concerns, and I'm quite aware of those into the future, whether it's concerns around indebtedness or concerns around ownership of certain resources. And so one hears those stories quite a lot. I think what inspires me, in fact, is that those conversations are even happening, because that opens the space for dialogue. And I think for a long time, we had very unquestioned relations with Europe, very unquestioned relationships with the US. And those are far more, in my mind, dangerous than ones where at least you're asking the question. And so where I hope it goes is to a couple of things. The one is that I think as Africa, and I think it's increasingly happening, we have to be a lot clearer about what it is communities, societies, nations want, and what they think is important. And then any deal or partnership you go into has to obviously then foreground what values you hold. Because if you're not able to do that, then in my view, the problem isn't China. The problem is any relationship you enter where you're not clear about your end of the table. So I'm hoping that where it goes is a space of questioning, of people leading with their values, and hopefully coming to realize that perhaps we've entered some deals that aren't so good, but perhaps we need to take a bit of responsibility for that and do differently. So that's my hope. And obviously, there's a lot more critical debate that happens about the China-Africa relations.
This next question is reminding me of a conversation we had. Let's see if it starts by, I can imagine futures thinking is seen as being elitist, privileged, or hierarchical. And they want to know how you would respond to these critiques. And the question is reminding me of a conversation we had in our first interview months ago, how you were sharing how actually when it comes to the language of the future and even imagining the future, that there are many traditions in communities, not just sort of this official, more organizational approach to futuring, that many communities actually have futuring practices. So this question reminds me of that. How would you respond?
So I think that the best way to address that, and this is one of the things we're hoping to do in the Capacity to Decolonize project, is to begin by acknowledging that there are these multiple approaches, these multiple, Real Miller calls them, anticipatory systems that exist out there. And many of them are occluded. They're occluded by the fact that there's a discipline that decides these are the concepts and these are the tools. But not just that. I mean, I think global systems we're in that privilege certain knowledge. So, Santos writes about, epistemicide, the fact that there are ways of knowing, and Lord knows there are ways of being that somehow aren't part of what we are trained to think about or be concerned with. And so I think anything outside of that kind of more open appreciation, I'm right now involved in a really cool project called 36 by 36. I think we can share a link to that. And it's about rethinking economy. And one of the immediate challenges we are confronting in that space is just this idea that there's this kind of finite lexicon of ideas about future economies. And they're great. I mean, we've heard about the donut economics and sustainability thinking, green economies, and I love all of those concepts. But as soon as we begin to accept or admit that there's a lot that's missing from that initial starting point, and it's missing because, like I said, of language, or it's missing because we tend to look at the North, or the textbooks came from somewhere, or the thinkers that we tend to have on YouTube come from somewhere, then I think we're in a very dangerous space. So my response to the critiques would be that as soon as you call it, as soon as you recognize that you are in this space that actually excludes a lot, then do something about it. And part of that, I think, is one, admitting it, but two, then reaching out beyond that, because who knows what you're leaving out. And I found that very empowering, actually, to look into other ways and other possibilities.
We had a really great conversation about anticipatory systems, and I'm glad you connected it back to that idea. We have a question about how is futures literacy being taught in South Africa. I would add to the question, tell us more about the anticipatory system in South Africa and how is futuring being taught there?
So futures literacy would be fairly, well, as a specific approach, that the UNESCO approach, fairly recently. So there've been a number of futures literacy labs, and a few have been run in South Africa and around Africa, and increasingly so. There's a new futures literacy chair. I hope it's been announced at the Center for Complex Transitions down at Stellenbosch. And so I think we'll see a lot more in that space. There are organizations that are doing it, and that's fantastic. But outside of that, I would say there's been a lot of foresight training through universities. So almost every large South African university would have some module around whether it's scenario planning or a strategic foresight or something like that. So I'm at Wits University that has it in the business school. There's elements in the School of Governance. There'll be other schools that have aspects of it. But I think increasingly we're seeing it expand from that kind of, I'd call maybe traditional foresight, into people beginning to have programs. WITS has somebody doing some work on what they're calling emancipatory futures. And there are other places beginning to have this much more exploratory. The US has a lot of it, so you have no shortage of people who are playing with different ideas about the future. But I think in Africa, from what I've seen, many institutions were still sort of on just beginning to have basic foresight courses usually, so not necessarily whole degree programs. As far as I know, I think Stellenbosch University is the only one that currently still has a master's, so an MPhil program in future. So all of that space exists. I think in terms of futures literacy and this sort of more, maybe more out there thinking and engaging with disciplines of anticipation, it's much more recent.
To build on that, there's a question about young people specifically in Africa. Are there efforts or examples of how young people are imagining the future or are participating in futures thinking?
Yeah, so I'm glad you didn't ask, are there young people? Are young people? There's so many of them, and you know what's great about them? They don't spend time thinking about the future, they spend time making it. They just do stuff. So I'm so energized actually by just the youth population on the continent. Often they're spoken about as a problem and a challenge and a time bomb, and whether it's child soldiers or young terrorists. And what I've seen, and I'm doing a lot of work in the civic tech innovation, I'm actually helping organize an Africa-wide network, is people who are just this interesting combination of being very either tech savvy or tech interested, and the tech could be high or low tech. It's not just necessarily about fancy tech, and are just doing stuff. They're just doing stuff. They're just hacking stuff. They're just doing it, and every now and then there may be some headline story about this kid who did this amazing thing. But I can assure you, it's not one kid doing one amazing thing. There are just a bunch of people doing such cool stuff. And what frustrates me sometimes, and maybe that's why I talk about allowing people the space to do different things, is that they're not always given that space. And it's not always people looking to be the president or looking to, run the show. It's people just looking for, permission. So it's a bit frustrating. In South Africa, we're in a bit of a culture of hackathons, and then the awards and the photo op for people like this, where they then get the winner gets a prize. And in several conversations I've been in now over time, what people are saying is that it's not about the once-off. It's not about just enable this. We talk about unemployment, and obviously that's a big issue on the continent, but we don't talk about the fact that there's so many people who are doing something that maybe is not, you can't define as employment, and so you probably still categorize them as unemployed. But they're not doing nothing. They're doing stuff that, in fact, I think in the thinking of whether it's public employment programs or community programs really could and should translate into livelihood. But we just have systems that can't see that. We only know employment or unemployment.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's rough.
Yeah, and ethnographic research on work, we kind of discovered the same thing. If you ask, if you look at work in a broader way, then these people that might otherwise be labeled as unemployed actually have a lot of work. They have their work and a series of projects that they're stringing together with purpose and that they want to achieve. So it is very interesting to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah.
People might otherwise see them as not being very productive as they might be described, but actually, like you said, they're literally making the future, experimenting.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I guess a space that mirrors that a little bit is if you think about the space of creatives. I think perhaps they're the precedent to this. You know, where you have a whole community of creative brilliance that inspires all of us, whether it's the music, the poetry, the narrative, the whatever. And you know, and what's the popular narrative about that, right? You're a hungry artist, right? And that it somehow became okay to see that as a profession where you're kind of relegating yourself to to probably being one of very many people who are going to live on their parents' couch or you know live on the streets possibly. And the fact that we didn't and we don't even now, I think, fully always appreciate the value of people who give us so much, and that ought to translate into livelihood in various ways, and that is work. I think I always find quite curious, and I think we're seeing the same thing in the tech space. One of the conversations I've been in, which is a bit controversial, has been in saying, and I've been watching these fights that the e-hailers are having, you know, the Ubers and whomever, and part of what I've felt is that you know, it's not just them, but if you look at the creatives, you look at people in tech, we've got a whole. If you look at the informal economy across Africa, we've got a whole bunch of types of work and activity that aren't really recognized in formal systems and in you know the kinds of benefits and packages and regulation that countries offer. And I think it's really detrimental in contexts like ours, because you really then end up having, as you said, people who are very busy doing work that is valued by society, not being protected by society and not being valorized by society. And that I find quite strange.
Mm-hmm. We have several questions here about fear and tragedy to envision the future, since it came up in our conversation. People agreeing that, you know, starting out with fears probably isn't a good start, and are curious about, you know, how offering solutions or how do you get people to imagine different alternatives? Since,
So,
you know, I do think even just given the past year, there's so much tragedy, so much, you know, fear in general. That is sort of a natural starting point. I guess people, if you could say more about how do we get them into a more, I guess, imaginative space, maybe make room for the fear, but get them to that more imaginative and possibly positive space. So that, yeah.
Yeah. So I tend not to concern myself too much about getting people into a positive space. And like I said, these are not easy ideas to play with.
Yeah.
What I think becomes important. So let's talk about what we do in a futures literacy lab process. And this is just obviously talking method, but I'd like to bring it back to answering the question.
Right.
It's okay to allow people to talk about their fears and to think about futures that are defined in those ways. And it's also okay to ask people about what they're hopeful about and what we think a good future would be and a better place might look like. The reality, however, if we're honest, is that we have no way of knowing the future, and we have no way of knowing whether either of those two, you know, to some extent, it has nothing to do with the future. It has to do with us and where we are now. And we just project that, right, into the future. So I think valorizing that is problematic on two levels. One is that lack of humility, where we are ourselves then colonizing the future with what we think ought to be or what we think is based on whatever probability we've drawn up. But I think the other thing that it does that's also very disempowering is it takes away our agency to act in the now, which is the only space we can act in.
Right.
And so what we tend to do in the lab process is to get people, you know, with some sort of a reframe scenario to really work not even at the level of words and ideas, but really of metaphor and you know, drawing or acting or sculpting or just doing something else that allows you to express futures in a bigger way, in a broader way that's not defined by history. And I think I've never seen anybody not enjoy that. And I think the reason that it's enjoyable is that it's not asking you the question about whether that future makes you happy or not. Sculpture is not a thing you can decide, and that's the truth about the future. It's as real as that sculpture you've just created. And so for me, I like that idea. I've had myself to become very comfortable in my unknowingness. And it's not a comfortable or a happy space, but I think that's not the point of it. And that's quite tricky, like I said, especially if you're in the space of consulting or in the space of working with organizations. It's quite tricky because people want answers and certainty. But I think what we need to focus on perhaps is how do we appreciate the future for what it is, but then focus on the now, which is pretty much the only thing we can do anything about.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't have to be a disempowered feeling that's ruled by a fear that you've projected onto the future. It wasn't necessarily there.
Right. That's so interesting. I mean, just hearing you talk about, the present as the space that we actually occupy, and that we can actually, reflect on the future, but think about what we're doing now and changing or adapting or however it is that we want to respond. But the other thing you just said, which I pull out, even just asking yourself the challenge, how do you think about a future that's not defined by history? What a great question to ask, right? We all probably have different practices and techniques, but even just raising that as a challenge in any kind of imagination space is critical. I mean, one of the things that we're concerned a lot about at the Institute when we're doing any kind of futuring project is making sure that different ways of ensuring that we're considering the widest range of possibilities as possible. And there are different frameworks and techniques for doing that to ensure yourself that you're looking at a full range of possible factors and so on. But, additionally, questions just like that, I think, could really help people's practices.
Yeah. I think, so I was in a process yesterday where I was giving feedback on how it went. And my feedback was, well, we're off center. And that's a good place to be because as soon as you're off of that road of really some real clarity about the future, that's the dangerous space. I think when we're finding ways to shift that a little bit and to broaden the gaze, I think we're onto something interesting.
Let's see other questions. We have a lot of questions here. I think to keep on the theme, there's a question here about coming back to the idea of decolonizing the future, and you mentioned struggling in your own practice and not being complicit in creating features that you didn't want to come into reality. The question's more about if you could share a specific example of a project or work where you realized that, and what did you do about it?
Wow, I wonder if there's just one.
Yeah,
I could pull out. Okay, let me give a kind of example. So a few years ago, I was involved, and maybe that's for me was the beginning of the challenge. It was a corporate foresight process where I was in fact supporting a foresight colleague, and it was the EXCO, sort of the top brass of this big industrial corporate, and we're doing this foresight. And already we had a question about the composition of who's in the room doing this foresight, because here you are with the C-suite of the organization talking about the future of an industry and an organization that's thousands of people deep, and where it's very likely that your first blind spot is the fact that you are the EXCO discussing and the only ones having this conversation about the future, and a real reluctance to delve or have any other kind of participatory process beyond the set of people who are there. Now, the reality is, like I said, foresights, it's fun, it's sexy, and you can go into your 2x2 and then lead people into a process where they develop a very cool, funky scenario. And then now you have somebody come in and draw it, and you've got a very cool animation about these very cool scenarios. And now you've got very, very happy client because they've got their very cool scenarios. Now, these scenarios have nothing to do with solving or addressing the actual issues that their organization faces, and perhaps their own role as that C-suite of people in sustaining the challenge. But from their perspective, the job is done, and they're really happy with the quality of this foresight work. That's not about any particular future having been wrong in what they did. But I remember in fact, I think that might have been just before 2013, 2014, when we had this process. And I remember in that moment thinking, what the hell are we doing? I'm not necessarily directly doing anything wrong, but I'm complicit in creating something that is not only meaningless, but is creating a belief among people who are people of influence and of power and could actually do something meaningful. I'm allowing them to think that they've done it. And so one of the narratives, in fact, I took out of that was telling people that I still think scenario planning, and I use it sometimes as well, is very useful and important and interesting. But I also think it's the beginning and not the end of what you're doing with foresight. And I think people sometimes are too happy with that product. They're too happy with this wonderful thing they've come up with and the epiphany they had doing it. And then they think the work is done and no action of any particular consequence has come out of it. So I think that worries me. I think when it serves to perhaps, create undue comfort and legitimacy. And I've been part of that.
Well, I think that was our last question. I want to, before we close, we have more information about your work and some key links that we'll put up. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to share any closing thoughts that you might have, or anything that you wanted to share with this community that I didn't get to ask you, but you wanted to share.
Yeah, no, so like I said, I think, so Real Miller talks about walking on two legs, and I mentioned these contradictions that I think I face, and sometimes you wonder whether you're living your truth. I guess that's something people say when you're occupying these two different spaces. And one of the things I found comfort in, so Bayo Komalefe talks about sort of post-activism, and I've gotten involved with the Emergence Network, which you mentioned in the intro. And part of why I think I've ended up in this slash kind of intro where I'm doing all these different things is he talks about post-activism being about the site when continuity becomes impossible, where you've come to the end of a road or the end of a rope. There are no words, and you now have to figure out something else, right? And so one of the projects I'm part of co-designing with him, called Vunja, is really about this idea that if you can't move on the road, then maybe you sink into the cracks, right? And that's also a direction. And there's a lot of, not necessarily comfort, but there's a lot of alternative. There's a lot of space that one can still play into. And I think going into those uncomfortable spaces is what I have found interesting, sort of trusting that small things can make a difference, not just the big organizations and the biggest project you can find to be part of. Sort of trusting the questioning and the simplicity, not just the certainty and the destination. And I think, yeah, it sounds a bit woo when I talk about it. Actually, a lot of my work is a lot more boring than than that. Well, not boring, but probably a lot more familiar to everybody than that. I think what I enjoy is just being able to have the humility and the confidence to question our practice and what we're doing. And I think to see that there's so much room to expand our approaches, to expand our tools, to be more inclusive. And that really excites me. Sorry, I'm just seeing chats blowing up here, but I can't quite see what they're saying. So I hope it's not somebody asking me to say something that I'm not saying.
There's a lot of questions, but we're not able to get to all of them. I also just want to we'll close out, but I also just want to really thank you for the conversation, for just sharing so much with this community and with me. I think what a great, this conversation, and what a great model for us all in developing a more reflective practice of foresight and not being afraid to ask these questions, making space for ourselves to bring these questions to our practice. So I personally want to thank you so much for that. Let me put up, before we close out, just a few slides so that you can see what's happening next. One moment. So I just want to share with all of you that our next Foresight talk will be on transition design. And that's April 15th at 8 a.m. And it's going to be with Terry Irwin and Gideon Kossoff from Transition Design Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And then I want to put up a few resources. Again, thank you, Geshe. Here's her LinkedIn, her project on the capacity to decolonize the future, and lots of links were shared in the chat. So I invite all of you to take a copy of the chat. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you so much, everyone.